I think I could say I started painting in 1949 when I finished school, when I got out of the undergraduate work at school. I think I would say, so that's 1949, 59, 69, 79, 89 would have been. So it's about 44 years.
Oh, you're a youngster.
Just a kid.
Just a kid.
Yes.
Just starting to
Yes.
paint.
Despite feeling as fresh as a kid, Robert Colescott has considerable expertise. During the late 1940s and early 50s, Colescott received his undergraduate and graduate training in art from the University of California at Berkeley. And during 1949-50, Colescott traveled to Paris and studied painting with Ferdinand Leger. Initially trained as an abstract painter, Leger had a major stylistic influence on Colescott, and the figure was reintroduced into his painting. Another influential period for Colescott was during his tenure at the American University in Egypt in 1966-67. Colescott states, "I responded to the art history there. The 3,000 years of non-white culture affected what I did." Increasingly, Colescott has become a major figure in American art. He's been exhibited widely and collected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Hirshhorn Museum, among others. In our Art New York studio, this venerable young kid talks about making art.
I paint myself a lot because even, and sometimes it's in some of the work it's been quite recognizable that I've put myself in the painting, my own self-portrait. But I think there are attitudes that have affected me a lot, and I paint about those things. I paint about my own responses and my own fears and my own worries and concerns. And sometimes, you know, it's like whistling in the dark. You kind of laugh at yourself and your own attitudes and your responses and your fears, you know. So I think it's largely about myself and about my response. There's a painting that's called Emergency Room, and it's a big canvas. It's almost as big as I do, which is probably about 10 feet across. It becomes almost like a panoramic view of life in America, and the emergency room itself is a kind of allegorical theme, which gives me a chance to talk about, to use the allegory of the emergency room in thinking about the whole culture, as a symbol of the whole culture and America principally, in that we deal with problems only in expedient ways, and we find ourselves always in this great mess. And the mess, as you see it in the emergency room, which is the United States, in my thinking, has a lot to do with race relations and hierarchies, racial hierarchies. It has a lot to do with leadership and religion, and what part religion plays in, you know, the life and death of the country. And the cynicism of leadership and of the religious establishment, the way we deal with people who don't fit in to our system is to think of them as animals and lock them up. And so I have in one corner of that painting, there's a sequence of prison, and the prisoners are killing each other with knives and so forth. And they all look like apes because that's the way they're considered. They're like animals. You lock up these fierce animals and you don't much care what they do behind the bars as long as they're behind the bars. And so the patient is one of the patients or both of the patients that are represented in the painting are already dead. You see, and everybody is so involved in the mechanics of the situation and trying to survive themselves or trying to achieve their position and protect their positions in the hierarchy. They are they're too occupied to even realize that the patient's already dead. You see, so those are the kinds of things that come together. They're the kinds of things that I talk about, and at times I isolate one facet or another, or two facets in a single painting. In that particular painting, the emergency room, I tended to bring in the whole brew, and I think in looking at a painting like that, and there aren't many, but in looking at a painting like that is so inclusive, I think you could find almost all of the subjects that I deal with. I deal with sex, especially interracial sex. These are difficult topics in America still. I deal with social problems in the society, you know, and let alone medicine. I even deal with medicine, you know. It's almost the one factor that is not even important, and yet it's principal to the painting. The painting through the medical allegory becomes about many things, but these are the things that I'm interested in, and it has to do with the society and the way people relate in this society, and the way I've always felt.
One of the interesting things about Bob's paintings is that they started out being a humorous kind of statements. The ones that he did on takeoffs on paintings in which he pretended that there were Afro-Americans in the subject matter, like Eat Dem Taters. I think you know about that. And also George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware. But in recent years, the paintings have gotten much tougher. They're always about race relations between Afro-Americans and white people. And somehow or other, Bob is able to put his finger on a pulse, which is extraordinary, and confront these problems with a great deal of humor and also zest and energy, and make really extraordinary and very well-made paintings.
This is not work that you can go up and make an easy kind of conclusion about. And I have to look at a lot of work, so that I'm used to going into a gallery and sort of, you know, looking very quickly, sizing up what's going on and coming to some kind of conclusion of what's going on. But with Colescott's work, as with some other artists that I know I have to slow down. I have to sort of really figure out what's going on and really sort of understand what's happening. I think that that viscerally, in his latest work, there's a very exhilarating feeling that I get, because in spite of the fact that the work looks very crude and cartoonish and caricatured, it's beautifully painted. So there's this kind of alternation between being seduced by, you know, the surface of the painting, being amused or challenged or annoyed, you know, by the caricatured, and then also then being put into a specific position depending on who you are through the content of the painting. So that sometimes you know, as a woman and an African-American woman, I get a little pissed off about what he's putting into the painting. But it all has, you know, some kind of story, so I have to sort of like look at his challenge. And we've had a lot of dialogue about that. I mean, I think, you know, his being an African-American male of a certain age and my being an African-American female of a certain age certainly has given our dialogues a lot of sort of dicey and spicy interaction. And I don't think that either one of us have ever compromised on how we felt about situations, but we've come to a kind of understanding. And I think certainly, you know, I always have some kind of reaction to what he's saying or doing about women, because he does have very specific, sort of generationally oriented attitudes about things, as I do.
Colescott's work is described as raucous, slap-on-the-back paintings, painted with gusto and abandon. The subject matter is clearly uncomfortable for both the viewer and the artist. Filled with racist, sexist stereotypes, Colescott offends as much as he challenges. Nevertheless, Colescott offers a powerful vision, and one which is rarely as obvious as it seems.
When Colescott was first showing his work in the late 70s, I mean, I think that many African-American people just thought it was like, I mean, and white people too, thought it was just like, you know, the most outrageous, tough thing that you ever do. I mean, how would one put it on the walls? And it was interesting to sort of see the types of people who would collect his work at that point. I mean, they certainly were people who had sort of like off-centered humor and really understood the satire. I think what happened with a lot of African American people is that they went for the gut reaction too quickly and didn't understand how the use of this stereotype was very subversive. It was subversive in many ways. It was on the one hand, he would take a very well-known composition from European history and put one or more figure, make one or more figure black, one or more of the key figures black. So that immediately shifted, you know, all the content of the painting that was very familiar to us and very, we thought we knew everything about the content of it. On the other hand, he would also do some depictions of, you know, black stereotypes like Black Crows or Uncle Tom and things like this, but always in this kind of very subversive way. But the subversion often was very provocative because it was involved usually some kind of sexual connotation also, so that the balance, I mean, he went right to the, you know, basic confrontation between African Americans and whites in this country, which is all about sex, because, you know, in slavery, you know, the power relationships were often acted out in terms of sexual power. The white man having unlimited access to the black woman and the black man not having any access at all to white women and sort of being lynched if they thought they could. So I think that what one had to do was, if you didn't get to like the kernel to sort of see how he had twisted it around, then it was a very emotional reaction to the stereotypes. And I think when I was looking at it at that point, I was very aware that I was being transgressive in enjoying these images. But there was something very liberating about understanding how there could be something else, you know, like to this type of imagery that was very negative.
The work has different levels. And one of the levels in the work is humor. And albeit ironic and sarcastic, but there is that level of humor. And I believe, you know, that a lot of very serious things are said in jest. And so if you want to say something and you want it to bite hardest, I think, it's sometimes to juxtapose irony and humor. The irony of a situation, the tragedy of a situation. And then the human response to this is often to laugh at it. We laugh at death every day. And so I have used humor as a tool, I think, as a tool to contrast the seriousness of the message, but also as a tool of seduction to bring you into the realm of my message, the realm of my content, you see.
This work, Gumbo, is filled with Colescott's acerbic humor. Phyllis Kine talks about this painting.
Gumbo. And in this painting, not only do you see a charming scene, a very elegant white woman with a sip of tea, drinking her tea, but the title Gumbo, of course, refers to New Orleans food and people, tourists going down there. The woman in the painting, the major woman in the painting, is obviously a tourist who has all of these servants, of course, they're black servants. There's one little man walking across the bottom of the canvas, and in the distance you see a lovely, almost Don Quixote-like view through the painting. It's deep space with a blue sky, and it seems very, very jolly. It seems very nice, but when you really look at it, you realize that even this painting, which at first glance doesn't have any of the violence, guns, it doesn't have blood, it doesn't have emergency rooms, but it's making a very strong statement, you see, about the way that no matter how far we've come, people still take for granted that the Afro-American community is second class, and here's this woman, this obviously upper crust woman, appreciating the gumbo. And how many people do you think are taking out the garbage and working and slaving in the kitchen? So this particular painting, although it starts out by seeming very lightweight, is also giving us a message. So the messages are really subliminal, and he depends on the humor of the situation. I mean, the difference in scale between the tiny little waiter and the largeness of the woman is really also hierarchical. It's not necessarily only humorous. But I do think that he does it almost with a touch that's light, despite the fact that it's heavy.
What Colescott works make you do is he engages everybody. Everybody has to be responsible in Colescott's work. White people have to be responsible for the creation of the stereotypes. Black people have to be responsible for reacting to these stereotypes and maybe feeding the stereotypes. And then we all have to be responsible in getting beyond the stereotypes and understand what Bob is saying, you know, like through this use of stereotypes. So that when he puts a black woman into Arnold Feeney's, you know, wedding portrait, yes, and, you know, does this in an act that he later described as just interjecting black people into art history, then one had to sort of think about what the image of blacks were in art history. A kind of counterpoint or response to Bob Colescott 20 years later came in Fred Wilson's Minding the Museum at the Maryland Historical Society, where he pulled out old, you know, 17th and 18th and 19th century portraits, you know, of Maryland's first families, and he put them on the wall and he highlighted where the black servants were, and they were always on the periphery, you know. But what Bob Colescott did was he took them from the periphery and put them right smack in the middle of the composition, making them one of the protagonists or the protagonist. For instance, you know, making George Washington Carver in that type of instance. So then you had to sort of look at, you know, George Washington in the composition of the Emanuel Leutze painting, you know, sort of going across. And you also, so you had to think about what was the role of blacks in a Revolutionary War. But then you had to wonder, who is this George Washington Carver guy? You know, and then you had to sort of look him up and sort of find out that this was, you know, a scientist in Tuskegee who distilled all these uses, you know, for the peanut. So it sort of doubles back in on itself again, because you have to look at this very familiar composition and sort of see a whole new cast of characters and wonder why the artist is putting them there, and then sort of figure out what your reaction is to the artist putting them in that context.
When I painted a long time ago, about 20 years ago, a painting called George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, people thought it was a kind of a cartoon with a lot of funny stereotypes in a boat with Carver, who was dressed in the uniform of George Washington as a general. What I really was addressing was my world as a boy growing up, being stereotyped, and seeing black people represented in popular media, which in those days was the radio and films and advertising, and seeing them represented in always a very menial and often disgraceful way. And then coming to the history books in school to find almost no references to what was called then the Negro contribution to the United States. So on the one hand, we had a very tokenistic and limited representation in the history books and in our education system, and then on the other hand, we were always being shown these minstrel images, you see, in the comics and in the films and so forth, and so it became my own personal conflict as to how to identify myself and how to be proud of my identity and heritage, and in the 30s at this time and into the 40s and 50s too. You know, you didn't see blacks involved in the society at large at different levels of the hierarchy. but you saw instead always, a black man with a broom, or engaged in some kind of menial Jim Crow job. My dad was one of them. He was a waiter on the Southern Pacific, and that was a black man's job, and it had absolutely no future. He could not even graduate to steward because a steward was white, you see. And so here he was a waiter for 40 years, a waiter doing the same work. He was an intelligent and a talented man.
So did you feel that becoming a painter was a way of getting off the...
No, I didn't. I did, I just thought of getting an education was a way to become, to separate myself from that stereotype. I thought getting educated, and that's what was drilled into us, that education was the answer. And so what you studied was considered very important, but I just didn't seem to fit into any of the niches that would have taken me more directly to a kind of social respect, such as being a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't seem to fit into that, so I decided, in a sense, I rebelled against that and became an artist, studied art and became an artist. But the impact of all of these things and of the grandparents who were tossed out of the neighborhood because they were black and were legally told to leave because there was a racial covenant in that neighborhood that excluded certain people. It excluded all Orientals, essentially all the non-white categories. I don't know, it could have excluded Jews as well, and possibly did, you see, at that time. So to see that happen, you see, those were just some incidences that I think formed an attitude of wanting to explore these things, wanting to control them. So when I started to make paintings in the mid-'70s that were strongly social comments, that were strong social comments, in a sense I did it for myself, setting up situations in the paintings that I could control. And I could look at, I could examine. In a sense, it was in a way like coming out, you see, and saying, well, here I am. Here's all these minstrel images. If this is what you think of me, here it is. You see, here I am, and so on. And then I began to put some of these characters into a kind of heroic attitudes. So that okay, you might think this of me, but I am a hero. I am capable of heroic acts. After all, I came out of slavery. You see, and so these were the attitudes that built a kind of response that has become very important in the work, and more with greater and greater complexity, and involving. I think some different kinds of casts of characters and different cultural influences in the way the work looks and so forth. But always as paintings, not just as comments, but always as a comment through the art of painting.
He's an original, and I think that just from the fact of being an original, that would be enough to make Bob Colescott a significant figure. I think the important thing, however, is that he's one of the few artists who I think has found a successful and viable way to deal with, the ever-evolving discourse we're having about art, the tenets of modernism, and ethnicity. It's become clear to me in my own sort of peregrinations around the art world that the art world still has not been able to absorb peoples of color, who engage in modernist dialogue. They're still very much more familiar, and comfortable with, Europeans who go to cultures of color and appropriate. I mean, they have 100 years of this tradition going on, starting with Gauguin and, you know, Tahiti and things like that. But the real challenge, you know, for the art world now is what happens when you get that Tahitian artist, all right, who's learned modern art from Gauguin and arrives in New York and wants to have a career. And whether or not, you know, like, it brings up all these issues that one has talked about in terms of authenticity, you know, diversity, multiculturalism, and all that types of thing. But the ultimate expression, you know, of all these kinds of concepts is cultural equity. In other words, are all these cultures going to have an equal place in particularly the American cultural scene on par with Europe? So, I mean, the whole idea of the hegemony of European culture is now being called into question, and whether or not Europe can accommodate them without the need to sort of keep control of the dialogue. And I think that Colescott's art essentially forces us to deal with those issues in a very forthright way. And he's the only artist I can think of who's really doing that in such an integral way through his art.